Hello and welcome to a video on Hipaa. Today we're going to be talking about caching and dealing with PHI de-identification and how to properly leverage and really think about caching whenever you're running a secure environment, in this case, Hipaa. With that said, let's get into it. Okay, so diving right in, you can see that we have a framework for Hipaa that we're talking about, and today we're going to be going into caching and persistence of PHI data. Now, one of the first things that we want to point out is that most software systems have a lot of different ways that they kind of splinter the data off and store the data. Now, a lot of these you may not be aware of. So you're going to want to at least just get some exposure to some of the problems that exist with caching, performance improvement, and just overall security risks whenever you're dealing with logging and those kind of things. So first of all, most systems that have any kind of performance enhancement or tuning, any kind of caching mechanisms, they're going to include SQL, just general databases overall, files. There may be cookies, local database storage or device storage that's going to be used, a content delivery network. The actual content could be stored in JavaScript or in the DOM, the document object model. So think basically the HTML itself. It could be stored on the machine itself for performance. And one of the things that you'll see is that in general, there are a lot of new technologies that are constantly evolving and coming about. One of those is NoSQL that is really evolving a lot. There really are a lot of other techniques for storage. Now, one of the other things is unintentional storage. Now, you may end up with unintentional storage by logging messages during development that don't get turned off during production use. Now, you might say, oh, come on, this is never going to happen. Well, the reality is typically developers aren't thinking about things like a business owner or like a division head of an organization who's trying to make sure that there is security in mind from the get-go. They're not necessarily thinking of it as a HIPAA security or data security officer would think about it. So you're going to want to at least have checklists and just set a standard when you're working on a HIPAA project for what the caching and security needs to look at. Where do you need to audit, and what are the rocks that you need to uncover whenever you're looking at this kind of caching and security? Now, what is the problem exactly with these different data models? Well, whenever you're dealing with PHI, if you remember, just kind of going back to the security rule and generally the privacy rule, the concept here is that we want to reduce the footprint of any PHI that we're sharing or storing to be only that which is 100% necessary. And really, generally speaking, this is going to kind of propagate out to all of this performance tuning and all of this caching. If data is cached, it can be picked up by someone who is looking at a cache instead of a really secure data storage. It's possible that your caching mechanism for your software is not secured, or it may be it's operating at a much lower standard of security than the rest of your application. So just think about this from a hacker or somebody who's trying to penetrate and get this data. They, generally speaking, are looking for the kind of soft spots on your Under Armour of your security. Okay, now once you have this idea of what you're going to audit, how exactly are you going to know that something is a risk? Well, the first thing that you want to note is that PHI information should generally be encrypted at rest. So no matter what, no matter where it is, even if it is in some of this kind of performance optimization kind of areas, you do want to make sure that it is encrypted at rest. So of course it should be encrypted in transit as well. So if it's sitting in one of these data repositories, for example, if somehow there is PHI data inside of a cookie, then what that means is that sensitive information is not only on the screen for the user to see, but it's also in a persistence layer that's a mechanism of the browser that user is using. And after they've finished their browsing session, that cookie may still be there. So this is a problem because if somebody somehow breached their machine, then some of their PHI information would be there without them having to log in and authenticate and be authorized to have access to that data. Now, this could be even worse if you have an administrator who is adminning something and data about a patient is saved to a cookie, and then somebody else can access that same machine and get access to those cookies. And now you can kind of see how this can be a huge problem. Now, it's probably an edge case that isn't going to be massively exploited when you're talking about cookies, but it could be. And this is a weakness that a lot of software is having to deal with, is the idea of cookies, local storage. Another one that's pretty bad and pretty prominent nowadays is a lot of systems use JavaScript, so they don't have to do page postbacks every time you change data or you save something, for example. Well, one of the beautiful things about JavaScript is it can handle that situation. It can just selectively load and change the data on the site without having to do a complete page refresh. But one of the downsides is it is client-side code. What that means is that a lot of the application functionality and access to the endpoints that push and pull the data is actually going to be revealed within that JavaScript code. In order for it to work for the browser, the actual code and a lot of the mechanics are exposed in that JavaScript. Does that make it inherently insecure? No. But the main point here is that there are weaknesses with these performance optimization techniques that you want to make sure are not causing you to breach and have breaches and deal with not delivering on the security rule for Hipaa. Now, one of the big things that we kind of talk about here with this is essentially only sending necessary data into the cache. This is probably the number one thing that you can do. And whenever you're working with a software development company, you want to ask them about these things. It's very simple once you're aware for you to essentially inspect what you expect. So if you're able to ask them, hey, what all are you sending into the cache, and what types of caching are you using, and how are we making sure that that is HIPAA secure? The other thing is user-specific caching should really be selective, if at all. So what do we mean by that? Typically, PHI information is isolated to being individualized. We're not going to typically see a large catalog search or a product detail page or some functionality on the site that general users are going to get. That's not going to be something that we're caching PHI data into. Typically, the PHI data that would get cached would be kind of a remnant of how the software is built. Possibly there's an open source tool that we're using, and that open source tool doesn't kind of understand that caching and persisting all the data is not ideal. So we're going to need to make sure that we kind of surgically remove any PHI from caching as much as possible. And then another thing that's really interesting is if you are building custom caching, or your software development team is, they should be able to put authentication and authorization in front of any access to cache data that has PHI in it. So this is another safeguard. You're basically wanting to put multiple levels of security in place where, one, you don't even put PHI information into caches, and then any caching that you do that might risk having PHI data in it, very pristine with the environment and how you're setting it up, or your software company is, so that they can ensure that there's authorization and authentication in order to access that secure PHI data. Finally, one of the other things that's really helpful is, just as we alluded to earlier with the JavaScript example and how a lot of that mechanical code to push and pull data is actually exposed to the browser, we also want to make sure that any API endpoints that can be found and that can be publicly visible via decompilation or easier means of accessing your software, we want to make sure that the routes and the, again, authorization, authentication to those API endpoints is non-trivial. There ought to be multiple factors of authentication and essentially a zero trust environment. In order to gain access to things, you have to really prove that you should have access. Now, this is a pretty high level explanation. If you're interested in a lot more detail, feel free to reach out to our team. We have a lot of very technical minds that would be happy to dive into the weeds. Hopefully this gives you an idea though, so you can at least be exposed to some of the risk areas. And the biggest thing with this is you just want to ask. You need to inspect what you expect. If you at least do that, what you'll find is most of the time you can get 80 to 90% of the major issues that would cause a problem with a relatively low amount of work, kind of the Pareto's principle. If you like this video, we would really appreciate if you smash that like button. And of course, if you'd like to see more, feel free to subscribe, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.